Detective Chief Robert Thompson had always been a hands-on kind of guy. Even after 22 years on the force and 6 months as the new police chief of Riverside County, he still preferred fixing things himself rather than calling for help. So when his teenage son complained that their home internet was running slower than usual, Robert knew exactly what to do. It was a beautiful Tuesday afternoon in late spring, the kind of day that made you want to skip work and sit outside. Robert had wrapped up his meetings early at the station and decided to tackle the Wi-Fi problem from home. His wife Patricia was still at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, and the kids wouldn't be back from school for another hour. Perfect timing. He grabbed his laptop from his home office and headed to the front porch. The wooden swing that Patricia had insisted on buying last month turned out to be the perfect spot for outdoor tech work. Robert settled in, opened his laptop, and pulled up the router settings. The password hadn't been changed in over 2 years, and with his son's friends constantly asking for the Wi-Fi code, it was definitely time for an update. The neighborhood around him was quiet, typical for a weekday afternoon. Riverside Heights was one of those suburban areas where most people worked during the day, and the streets stayed peaceful until the evening rush. Robert had fallen in love with the area the moment Patricia showed him the house listing. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and a real sense of community. After years of living in apartments closer to the city, this felt like paradise. As he typed away on his laptop, Robert couldn't help but smile. 6 months ago, if someone had told him he'd be sitting on his own front porch in a neighborhood like this, he would have laughed. Growing up in the inner city, owning a home in Riverside Heights seemed impossible. But here he was, police chief of the county and homeowner in one of the nicest areas around. The Wi-Fi setup was taking longer than expected. The old router was being stubborn, and Robert found himself having to reset it multiple times. He stood up from the swing, laptop in hand, and walked around the front yard to test the signal strength. Technology could be frustrating, but Robert had learned patience over the years. In police work, rushing usually led to mistakes. From his spot near the mailbox, Robert noticed a woman across the street standing at her window. She seemed to be looking in his direction, but he didn't think much of it. New neighborhoods meant curious neighbors, and he figured word was still spreading about the new family on Maple Street. He gave a friendly wave, but the woman stepped back from the window without responding. Robert shrugged and continued his work. The router finally cooperated, and he was able to set up a new, more secure password. He made a mental note to update all the family devices later. His son would probably complain about having to reconnect his gaming console, but security was worth the minor inconvenience. As he worked, Robert thought about how different his life had become. Just 2 years ago, he was Detective Thompson, working long hours on tough cases in the city. The promotion to police chief had come with a lot of responsibility, but also opportunities he'd never imagined. Moving his family to a safer area, better schools for the kids, and a chance to really make a difference in community policing. The transition hadn't been completely smooth. Some of the older officers were still getting used to his leadership style, and there were always budget meetings and political considerations that came with the job. But Robert believed strongly in building bridges between law enforcement and the community. He wanted to be the kind of police chief people could trust and respect. He glanced at his phone and saw a text from Patricia asking if he'd remembered to pick up milk on the way home. Robert smiled and typed back that he was already home working on the internet issue. She responded with a laughing emoji and a reminder that dinner was at 6. The afternoon sun was warm on his face as Robert continued testing the Wi-Fi connection from different spots around the property. The signal was strong near the house but got weaker toward the back of the yard. He made another mental note to consider a Wi-Fi extender if the family planned to use internet devices in the backyard during summer. Across the street, Robert noticed the same woman was back at her window. This time she seemed to be talking on the phone while looking in his direction. He wondered if she was trying to figure out who the new neighbors were. Robert had learned that some communities could be slow to warm up to newcomers, especially when those newcomers looked different from the majority of residents. But Robert wasn't worried. He dealt with much tougher situations than curious neighbors. His philosophy was simple: be friendly, be professional, and give people time to get to know the real you. Most prejudices came from fear of the unknown. And once people realized you were just a regular person trying to live your life, things usually worked out fine. He closed his laptop, satisfied that the Wi-Fi was now working properly. The new password was secure, the connection was strong, and he'd even managed to update some security settings that had been bothering him for weeks. Not bad for an hour's work on a beautiful afternoon. Robert decided to stay outside a little longer and enjoy the weather. He pulled out his phone to check emails from the station. Nothing urgent, which was always a relief. One of the benefits of good police work was preventing problems before they became emergencies. As he scrolled through his messages, Robert heard a car door slam somewhere nearby. Then another. He looked up to see a police cruiser parked at the end of his street. For a moment, Robert felt the automatic tension that came with seeing unexpected police activity in a residential area. Then he remembered he was the police chief, and if there was a problem in his neighborhood, he should probably know about it. He stood up from the porch swing, still holding his laptop and phone, and wondered what could be happening on such a quiet Tuesday afternoon. In his experience, daytime police calls in suburban neighborhoods usually involved minor disputes, suspicious activity reports, or the occasional break-in. Whatever it was, Robert figured he might as well see if his officers needed any assistance. Little did he know that he was about to become the center of the most embarrassing misunderstanding of his career. Beverly Chen had lived on Maple Street for almost 15 years. In that time, she'd seen families come and go, watched children grow up, and appointed herself as the unofficial keeper of neighborhood safety. At 58, she worked from home as a real estate agent and spent most of her day with a clear view of the street from her office window. Beverly prided herself on knowing everyone in the area. She knew which houses had teenagers who might throw parties, which residents traveled frequently for work, and which delivery trucks belonged in the neighborhood. This attention to detail had helped prevent 2 actual break-ins over the years, and Beverly considered her vigilance a community service. So when she noticed a man she didn't recognize sitting on the porch across the street with a laptop computer, Beverly immediately felt something was off. She'd been working on client files when movement outside caught her eye. The man appeared to be African American, probably in his 40s, wearing casual clothes. Beverly was certain she'd never seen him before. The house across the street had been sold about 6 months ago, but Beverly rarely saw the new owners. She'd heard through neighborhood gossip that a family had moved in, but she'd been traveling for work during their first few weeks and had never properly introduced herself. Still, Beverly was usually good at spotting residents versus strangers. As she watched, the man seemed to be focused intently on his laptop screen. He'd type for a while, then pause and look around the neighborhood. Something about his behavior struck Beverly as suspicious. Why would someone sit outside with a computer in the middle of the day? And why did he keep looking around like he was watching for something? Beverly had attended a community safety meeting just 2 weeks earlier, where the local police had warned residents about various scams and criminal activities. One presentation had covered how thieves sometimes used laptops to hack into home security systems or steal personal information from unsecured Wi-Fi networks. The presentation had made Beverly more aware of potential technology-based crimes. The man stood up from the porch swing and began walking around the front yard, still carrying his laptop. Beverly watched as he stopped at different spots, seeming to test or check something on his computer. This behavior confirmed her suspicions. Nobody just wandered around their own property with a laptop unless they were up to something. Beverly tried to remember if she'd seen any cars in the driveway of that house recently. The garage door was usually closed, so it was hard to tell if anyone was actually living there full-time. For all she knew, the house could be empty, and this man could be taking advantage of an absent homeowner situation. She picked up her phone and considered her options. Beverly had called police before for suspicious activity, and she'd rather be safe than sorry. The last time she'd reported something, it turned out to be a false alarm, just a delivery driver who'd gotten confused about addresses. But the police had thanked her for being alert and told her it was better to report concerns than ignore them. The man was now standing near the mailbox, still focused on his laptop screen. Beverly decided she couldn't ignore this any longer. She dialed 911 and waited for the operator to answer. "What's your emergency?" came the professional voice on the other end. "Hi, this is Beverly Chen at 847 Maple Street in Riverside Heights. I need to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood." "What type of suspicious activity are you observing, ma'am?" Beverly looked out her window again. The man was still there, now walking back toward the porch with his laptop. There's a man I don't recognize sitting outside a house across the street with a laptop computer. He's been there for about 30 minutes and his behavior seems really suspicious. Can you describe what makes his behavior suspicious? Well, he's just sitting there with this computer, typing and looking around the neighborhood like he's watching for something. And now he's walking around the property with the laptop, like he's testing something or trying to connect to networks he shouldn't be accessing. The operator asked for more details about the location and the individual Beverly was observing. Beverly provided the address and described the man as well as she could from her distance. Ma'am, is this person on public property or private property? He's on the front lawn and porch of 851 Maple Street. I'm not sure if anyone actually lives there right now. The house was sold a few months ago, but I rarely see anyone there. Have you seen this person before in the neighborhood? No, never. And I know everyone around here. I've lived on this street for 15 years. The operator assured Beverly that an officer would be dispatched to check on the situation. Beverly felt relieved that she'd done the right thing. Better to have police investigate and find nothing wrong than to ignore potential criminal activity. After hanging up, Beverly continued watching from her window. The man had sat back down on the porch swing and was typing on his laptop again. He seemed completely relaxed, which Beverly found even more suspicious. In her experience, people doing something wrong usually looked nervous or tried to hide what they were doing. About 10 minutes later, Beverly saw a police cruiser turn onto Maple Street. She felt validated in her decision to call. The officer would be able to determine what the man was really doing and whether there was any cause for concern. But as Beverly watched the scene unfold, she began to feel a strange sense of unease. Something about the situation seemed different than she'd expected. The man on the porch didn't seem surprised or concerned about the police car. In fact, he appeared to be looking at the cruiser with what Beverly could only describe as professional interest. Beverly had seen enough police interactions to know how people usually reacted when officers arrived. Innocent people might be confused or slightly nervous. Guilty people often tried to run or became defensive. But this man seemed almost familiar with the situation. The police cruiser pulled to a stop and Beverly watched as the officer got out. Even from her distance, Beverly could see that the officer was a young woman. The policewoman approached the man on the porch, and Beverly strained to hear their conversation. What Beverly heard next made her stomach drop. "Good afternoon, Chief Thompson," the officer said in a voice that carried clearly across the quiet street. Chief Thompson. Beverly's mind raced as the implications hit her. She'd just called the police on the police chief. The police chief who lived across the street from her. The police chief who had every right to sit on his own porch with his own laptop doing whatever he wanted to do. Beverly sank into her office chair, horrified by what she'd done. How could she have been so wrong? How could she have lived across the street from the police chief for 6 months without knowing who he was? As the reality of the situation settled in, Beverly realized she had two choices: hide in her house and hope this would blow over, or face the music and try to make things right. Neither option seemed particularly appealing, but Beverly knew she couldn't just pretend this hadn't happened. She'd made a mistake, a big one, and now she had to figure out how to fix it. Officer Diana Rodriguez had been having a relatively quiet Tuesday shift when the call came through dispatch. Suspicious person with a laptop at 851 Maple Street in Riverside Heights. The address immediately caught her attention because she knew exactly who lived there. Diana had worked under Chief Thompson for 3 years before his recent promotion, and she had nothing but respect for the man. He was the kind of leader who remembered officers' names, asked about their families, and always had time to listen when someone needed advice. When he'd moved to Riverside Heights after becoming chief, Diana had been happy for him and his family. As she drove toward Maple Street, Diana couldn't help but smile. She had a pretty good idea what was happening here. Riverside Heights was the kind of neighborhood where people called police about everything from unfamiliar cars parked on the street to teenagers walking through after school. Usually these calls turned out to be nothing, but department policy required officers to respond and investigate. Diana pulled up to the address and immediately saw Chief Thompson sitting on his front porch with his laptop. He looked completely relaxed, like someone enjoying a nice afternoon at home. When he noticed the police cruiser, he looked up with mild curiosity rather than concern. "Good afternoon, Chief Thompson," Diana said as she approached the porch, trying to keep the amusement out of her voice. "Officer Rodriguez," the chief replied with a slight smile. What brings you to my neighborhood this afternoon? Well, sir, we received a call about suspicious activity at this address. Someone reported a man with a laptop acting suspiciously. Chief Thompson looked down at his laptop, then back at Diana with raised eyebrows. I see. And what exactly did this person find suspicious about updating my Wi-Fi password? The caller mentioned someone they didn't recognize was sitting outside with a computer, possibly trying to access neighborhood networks illegally. Diana watched as understanding dawned on the chief's face. She could see him processing the situation, probably connecting the dots about what had really happened here. Let me guess, Chief Thompson said, closing his laptop and standing up. Someone called because they saw a black man with a computer and assumed I was up to no good. Diana nodded, feeling uncomfortable about the racial implications of the call, but knowing they couldn't ignore what had happened. The caller said they'd never seen you before and didn't think anyone lived here. I've been living here for 6 months, Chief Thompson said, his voice remaining calm but with a slight edge of frustration. My name is on the mailbox. My family and I moved here when I took the chief position. I know, sir. I was at your promotion ceremony, remember? Chief Thompson smiled at that. Diana had indeed been at the ceremony, along with most of the department. It had been a proud moment for everyone who knew him. So what happens now? Chief Thompson asked. Do you need to file a report about this call? Diana wasn't entirely sure about protocol for this situation. She'd never responded to a suspicious person call that turned out to involve her own boss. I should probably talk to whoever made the call, let them know everything is fine. Just then, both Diana and Chief Thompson noticed a woman coming across the street. She was middle-aged, walking quickly but hesitantly, like someone who wasn't sure if they were making the right decision. That might be her, Diana said quietly. The woman approached them, looking embarrassed and nervous. Excuse me, she said, addressing Diana first. I'm Beverly Chen. I live across the street. I think I might be the one who called you. Diana nodded. Yes, ma'am. We're here responding to your call about suspicious activity. Beverly looked at Chief Thompson, who was watching her with patient curiosity. I am so sorry, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I had no idea you lived here. I thought. I assumed. You assumed what, exactly? Chief Thompson asked, his tone still professional but wanting to hear her explanation. I saw you with the laptop and I didn't recognize you, and I thought maybe someone was trying to hack into Wi-Fi networks or something. We had a community safety meeting recently about technology crimes, and I guess I overreacted. Diana could see that Beverly was genuinely embarrassed and sorry, but she also noticed that the woman still hadn't directly addressed the racial aspect of what had happened. Mrs. Chen, Chief Thompson said, I want to make sure I understand. You saw a black man you didn't recognize with a laptop, and your first thought was that he must be committing a crime. Beverly's face flushed red. It wasn't about race. I would have called about anyone I didn't recognize doing something that seemed suspicious. But would you really? Chief Thompson asked gently but firmly. If you'd seen a white man you didn't recognize sitting on a porch with a laptop, would your first assumption have been criminal activity? Beverly was quiet for a long moment. Diana could see her struggling with the question, maybe really thinking about her own thought process for the first time. I don't know, Beverly finally admitted. Maybe not. I think I owe you a much bigger apology than I realized. Chief Thompson nodded appreciatively. I appreciate your honesty, Mrs. Chen, and I appreciate you admitting that maybe race played a role in your assumptions. Diana felt proud of her chief in that moment. He was handling this situation with exactly the kind of grace and wisdom that made him a good leader. He wasn't attacking Beverly or making her feel terrible, but he also wasn't letting her off the hook for what had happened. Can I ask you something? Chief Thompson continued. Have you ever actually seen me or my family around the neighborhood? My kids walk to the bus stop every morning. My wife drives past your house on her way to work at the hospital. Beverly thought about it. Now that you mention it, I think I have seen a woman and some kids occasionally. But I work from home and I don't always pay attention to... She stopped mid-sentence, apparently realizing how that sounded. If she paid enough attention to call police about suspicious activity, she should have paid enough attention to notice her actual neighbors. Mrs. Chen, Chief Thompson said, I don't want you to feel terrible about this, but I do want you to think about what happened here today. Assumptions based on race can be dangerous. In a different situation with different people involved, this could have escalated in ways that hurt someone. Diana knew he was right. She'd seen too many situations where false assumptions led to unnecessary confrontations, sometimes with tragic results. "What can I do to make this right?" Beverly asked. "Well, for starters, maybe we could actually be neighbors instead of strangers," Chief Thompson suggested. "My wife Patricia and I would love to meet the people on our street. We've been so busy with work and the kids that we haven't done a good job of introducing ourselves." Beverly looked relieved at the suggestion. "I would like that very much. And again, I am truly sorry for what happened today." Diana watched this exchange with interest. This was community policing at its best, turning a negative situation into an opportunity for understanding and connection. Word traveled fast in Riverside Heights. By evening, half the neighborhood had heard some version of what happened on Maple Street. The story grew and changed with each telling, but the basic facts remained the same. Someone had called the police on the police chief while he was sitting on his own front porch. Chief Thompson spent the rest of Tuesday afternoon thinking about the incident. After Officer Rodriguez left and Beverly Chen returned to her house, he'd gone inside to tell his wife Patricia about what happened. Her reaction had been a mixture of frustration, sadness, and determination. "This is exactly why we need to be more active in the community," Patricia said as she prepared dinner. "People can't make assumptions about what they don't know." Patricia Thompson was a pediatric nurse at Riverside General Hospital, and she dealt with her share of awkward situations over the years. Parents sometimes seemed surprised to discover that their child's nurse was a highly educated black woman. She'd learned to handle these moments with grace, but it never stopped being tiring. "I keep thinking about what could have happened if things had gone differently," Chief Thompson told his wife. "What if it had been a different officer responding? What if Beverly had decided to confront me herself instead of calling police first?" "But that's not what happened," Patricia reminded him. "Officer Rodriguez handled it perfectly, and Beverly seemed genuinely sorry once she realized her mistake." "She did," Chief Thompson agreed. "But I can't help wondering how many other people in this neighborhood see me and think suspicious instead of neighbor." Their 16-year-old son, Kevin, walked into the kitchen just as they were discussing the incident. He'd heard about it from his younger sister, who'd gotten the story from their parents when she came home from school. "Dad, that's so messed up," Kevin said, shaking his head. "You're literally the police chief and someone called the cops on you for using Wi-Fi." "Language, Kevin," Patricia said automatically. But her heart wasn't really in the correction. "Sorry, Mom, but seriously, this is crazy. What are we going to do about it?" Chief Thompson looked at his son, impressed by the mature way Kevin was handling the situation. At 16, Kevin was old enough to understand the racial implications of what had happened, but young enough to still be outraged by unfairness. "Well," Chief Thompson said slowly, "I've been thinking about that. Maybe this is an opportunity to do something positive." Over dinner, the Thompson family discussed ideas for turning the afternoon's embarrassing incident into something constructive. Patricia suggested hosting a neighborhood barbecue. Kevin thought they should organize some kind of community meeting. Their 13-year-old daughter Ashley wondered if they should just move to a different neighborhood where people wouldn't make assumptions about them. "We're not moving," Chief Thompson said firmly.
"This is our home, and we belong here just as much as anyone else."
But Ashley raises a good point about people making assumptions. Maybe the real problem is that we're all strangers to each other. By the time they finished eating, the family had decided on a plan. They would organize a neighborhood meet and greet event, giving everyone on Maple Street and the surrounding blocks a chance to actually get to know each other. It would be casual, family-friendly, and focused on building real community connections. Meanwhile, Beverly Chen was having her own family discussion across the street. Her husband David had come home from work to find Beverly upset and embarrassed about the day's events. When she told him what happened, David was quiet for a long time. "Bev," he finally said, "what were you thinking?" "I was thinking I was being a responsible neighbor," Beverly replied defensively. "You know, I've always kept an eye on the neighborhood. But calling the police because you saw a black man with a laptop? Come on, honey. You have to see how that looks." David Chen was a software engineer who worked with people of all backgrounds. He'd always been more aware of racial issues than his wife, partly because of his own experiences as an Asian American in predominantly white workplaces. "It wasn't about race," Beverly insisted, but even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. "Then why didn't you just go over and introduce yourself instead of calling 911? David asked gently. Why did your mind immediately jump to criminal activity? Beverly couldn't answer that question, and her silence spoke volumes. I think you need to do more than just apologize, David continued. Chief Thompson was really gracious about this, but you could have created a dangerous situation. Beverly knew her husband was right. She'd been thinking about the incident all afternoon, replaying her thought process and trying to understand where she'd gone wrong. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that race had probably influenced her assumptions more than she wanted to admit. What should I do? She asked. Well, for starters, maybe actually get to know your neighbors, and maybe think about why you assumed the worst instead of the best. The next morning, Beverly Chen did something she'd never done before. She baked cookies and walked across the street to properly introduce herself to the Thompson family. Patricia Thompson answered the door, looking surprised but pleased to see her neighbor standing there with a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Beverly Chen from across the street. I wanted to apologize again for yesterday and maybe start over with a proper introduction. Patricia smiled and invited Beverly in for coffee. The two women spent an hour talking about their families, their work, and their hopes for the neighborhood. Beverly learned that Patricia was a nurse, that the Thompsons had two teenagers, and that they'd been looking forward to getting more involved in community activities. My husband mentioned wanting to organize some kind of neighborhood gathering, Patricia said. Maybe you could help us figure out the best way to do that. Beverly's face lit up. I would love to help. I know everyone on this street, and I think most people would be excited about a chance to get together. As they planned the neighborhood event, Beverly found herself genuinely liking Patricia Thompson. The woman was warm, funny, and clearly devoted to her family. Beverly couldn't help but wonder what kind of friendship might have developed months earlier if she'd simply walked across the street to introduce herself instead of watching from her window. By the end of the week, word about the neighborhood gathering had spread throughout Riverside Heights. Some residents were excited about the opportunity to meet their neighbors. Others were curious about the police chief's family. A few seemed hesitant, possibly uncomfortable with the idea of socializing across racial lines. But Chief Thompson and his family were determined to make the event a success. They saw it as a chance to build the kind of community they'd always wanted to live in, one where people knew each other as individuals rather than making assumptions based on appearance. The incident that had started with a misunderstanding about Wi-Fi passwords was becoming something much larger. A real conversation about community assumptions and what it meant to be good neighbors in an increasingly diverse world. 2 weeks after the Wi-Fi incident, Maple Street looked different than it had in years. Colorful balloons hung from mailboxes, folding tables covered with food lined the sidewalk, and neighbors who had lived near each other for years were finally having real conversations. The Thompson family's neighborhood gathering had grown beyond anything they'd originally planned. What started as a simple meet and greet had become a block party that drew families from 3 different streets. Beverly Chen had proven to be an excellent organizer, using her real estate connections to arrange for permits, tables, and even a small sound system. Chief Thompson stood in his front yard, watching kids play games while adults shared stories and phone numbers. His son Kevin was teaching a group of younger children how to throw a football, while his daughter Ashley had somehow become the unofficial face painter for the event. Patricia was deep in conversation with several neighbors about organizing a book club. I have to admit, this turned out better than I expected, Beverly Chen said, approaching Chief Thompson with a plate of food. Try the potato salad. Mrs. Rodriguez from Pine Street made it, and it's incredible. Chief Thompson accepted the plate gratefully. Over the past 2 weeks, he and Beverly had developed an unlikely friendship. Her genuine remorse about the incident had led to genuine effort to understand her own biases, and Chief Thompson respected people who were willing to do that hard work. Beverly, I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done to make this happen, he said. This event is exactly what our neighborhood needed. I should be thanking you, Beverly replied. You could have made this situation much worse for me, but instead you turned it into something positive. I learned a lot about myself that day, and not all of it was comfortable to face. Beverly had indeed done some serious self-reflection since the incident. She'd started paying attention to her own thought patterns, noticing when she made assumptions about people based on their appearance. She'd also started reading books about racial bias and had even attended a community workshop about unconscious prejudice. "Can I ask you something?" Beverly said, lowering her voice slightly. "That day when I called the police, did you know immediately what was happening?" Chief Thompson considered the question. "Not immediately, but pretty quickly. When I saw Officer Rodriguez's expression, I could tell this wasn't a regular patrol stop. And when she told me someone had reported suspicious activity, it wasn't hard to figure out what kind of suspicious I must have looked." "I'm still so embarrassed about it," Beverly said. "Don't be embarrassed," Chief Thompson replied. "Be educated. The fact that you recognized your mistake and decided to learn from it, that's what matters now." Across the yard, Officer Diana Rodriguez was enjoying her day off at the neighborhood party. She'd been invited by Chief Thompson and was impressed by how the community had come together. Several neighbors had approached her to thank her for her service, and she'd had interesting conversations about community policing and safety. Officer Rodriguez called out Tom Peterson, an elderly man from down the street. "My wife wants to know if you think we should start a neighborhood watch program." Diana had been expecting this question. Neighborhood watch programs could be valuable, but they could also become problematic if people weren't properly trained about what actually constituted suspicious activity. "I think that's a great idea, Mr. Peterson, but it would need to be done right. We'd want to have some training sessions about what to look for and when to call police versus when to just introduce yourself to someone new." Chief Thompson overheard this conversation and joined them. "That's actually something we've been thinking about at the department. We could offer some community policing, workshops that help people understand the difference between actual suspicious activity and just unfamiliar activity." Several neighbors gathered around as they discussed the idea. It turned out that many people were interested in learning more about how to be good community members without overreacting to normal neighborhood activities. "The key is getting to know each other," Chief Thompson explained. "When you know your neighbors, you can tell the difference between someone who belongs and someone who doesn't. But when everyone is a stranger, people start making assumptions based on other factors." Patricia Thompson watched her husband talking with the neighbors and felt proud of how he was handling everything. As a black family in a predominantly white neighborhood, they'd known there might be challenges. But instead of letting this incident drive them away or make them defensive, they'd used it as an opportunity to build bridges. "Mrs. Thompson," said a voice behind her. Patricia turned to see Linda Williams, a woman from the next street over. "I wanted to thank you and your family for organizing this. My kids have been playing with neighborhood children they never knew existed, and I've met more neighbors today than in the 5 years we've lived here." Patricia smiled. "That's exactly what we were hoping for. It's amazing how much difference it makes when people actually talk to each other, instead of just waving from their cars." As the afternoon wore on, the conversations became deeper and more meaningful. People shared stories about their families, their work, and their dreams for the community. Several neighbors exchanged contact information and made plans for future get-togethers. Chief Thompson found himself in a conversation with 3 other fathers about coaching youth sports. Beverly Chen was coordinating with several women about starting a community garden. The teenagers, led by Kevin Thompson, were making plans for a neighborhood basketball tournament. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation was happening between Beverly Chen and Patricia Thompson. The 2 women had discovered they had more in common than either had expected. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd just walked over and introduced myself 6 months ago," Beverly said. "We could have been friends this whole time." "We're friends now," Patricia replied. "And maybe this happened the way it was supposed to happen. Sometimes it takes a wake-up call to make people really examine themselves and their communities." As the sun began to set, neighbors started cleaning up and saying their goodbyes. But it was clear that something had fundamentally changed on Maple Street. People who had been strangers that morning were making plans to have dinner together. Kids who had never played together were already asking for playdates. Chief Thompson and his family stood on their front porch, watching the last of their neighbors head home. The street was quiet again, but it felt different now. It felt like a real community. "Dad," Kevin said, "do you think this would have happened if that lady hadn't called the cops on you?" Chief Thompson thought about it. "Probably not exactly like this, but I'd like to think we would have found some way to connect with our neighbors eventually." "I'm proud of how you handled everything," Ashley added. You could have been really angry, but instead you made something good happen. That's what good leaders do, Patricia said, putting her arm around her husband. They turn problems into solutions. Chief Thompson looked at his family, then at the quiet street that now felt like home in a way it hadn't before. The Wi-Fi password incident had been embarrassing and frustrating, but it had also been exactly the catalyst their neighborhood needed. Sometimes the best communities were built not in spite of difficult conversations, but because of them. And sometimes a simple misunderstanding about technology could lead to a much more important understanding about humanity. 3 months later, Riverside Heights had become a model for community policing and neighborhood engagement. Other areas started asking Chief Thompson to share what they'd learned about building bridges between law enforcement and residents. Beverly Chen had become an advocate for bias training and was working with the police department to develop educational programs. But most importantly, the people on Maple Street had learned that the best security system wasn't cameras or alarms or even vigilant neighbors watching from windows. It was knowing and caring about the people who lived around you. The Wi-Fi password had been successfully updated that Tuesday afternoon, but the real connection that got established was between neighbors who finally decided to see each other as individuals, rather than strangers to be feared.